On behalf of the UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, I'd like to welcome everyone in the room and those of you watching via live stream to this evening's Discover Alaska lecture. My name is Debbie Hall, and I'm a member of the Delta Kappa Gamma group, and our group is in charge of hosting these events for you this summer. At UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Alaska, our Tra, Nada, Yeda campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the lower Tanana River. This year's Discover Alaska lectures are presented by the UAF Institute of Arctic Biology faculty members. Tonight, we will hear from Knut Kielland, professor of ecology. He first came to Alaska in the late 70s to work on the muskox farm in Unalakleet. He is now a professor of ecology in the Department of Biology and Wildlife Institute of Arctic Biology. And I also understand he likes to cook and clean and practice his harmonica. Please help me welcome Knut.
It's true. I like to cook and clean. Okay, can you hear me fine? Well, live with the consequences. I'm honored and happy to be here tonight as part of this series. And although some of you might think the title is somewhat presumptuous, which I will agree with, I hope that what I will present is going to be, rather than a unifying theory, rather a few sort of natural history vignettes regarding how herbivores and their feeding activities interact with the ecosystems at large in Alaska, and how they contribute to the structure and the function of this ecosystem that we call our home. So herbivores come in many shapes and sizes. I'm going to be focusing here largely on vertebrates, mammals, rather than insects, so we're going to mention a little bit about insects. Unfortunately, there are lots of these small mammals that have important functions in the ecosystems and are just interesting in their own right. Unfortunately, we haven't done much work on them, so I'm just going to leave them up and say, there's one group of organisms I'm going to ignore. Sorry. Red squirrels. Everybody loves to hate them or hates to love them. Again, that's a species that has not been done a lot of work regarding sort of their effects on ecosystems, although they clearly have large effects. We have some rodents with punk hairdos, like the porcupines. Also, some species that affect forest structure and the individual performance of trees. Again, they just go in the ignore box, I'm sad to admit. And lastly, a little harder to omit, but nevertheless, we haven't done much work on beavers. Also, there's people now here at UAF that's doing some fantastic research on beavers. So next year, Ken Tate might come in here and talk about beavers. But there again, although they are the engineers of rivers and waters, I'm not going to be talking about beavers. What I will be talking about, though, is this idea of organisms, species as ecosystem engineers in regards to how their morphologies, their physiology, and their behavior put together affects their environment and affects the resource array for other organisms, including their own, and how that is confer both physical and biological changes to the environment. that then, from which emerge other processes that would not be able to we couldn't be able to recognize in the absence of these particular species. That is changing then the structure and function of their homes. So I will be talking mostly about some work on moose and snowshoe hares, or as you will say, the high bush and the low bush moose. Many of you probably just think of moose as just food security, but there is more to it than that. And this idea that these large, elegant, delightful animals wandering around at fairly low densities, munching away on the brushwood, that process and that interaction between a consumer and its food resource precipitate a whole range of ecological events. And there's some of these ecological events I want to discuss with you today. So I want to keep in mind then that these events precipitated by these herbivores is shaping the structure and the function of the ecosystem. As you are walking out in the woods, typically we don't think of that this is a result of a consumer. They're just plants doing their own thing. They're limited by nutrients, and they just try to suck it up as fast as they can and get on with their lives. But there are all kinds of these trophic interactions of who eats whom that changes then the composition of the landscape. And that's one of the sort of themes I'd like to discuss with you today. So this business of here mammalian herbivory as ecosystem engineering. It sounds kind of fairly serious scientific stuff. This idea of physiochemical effects and biological effects that precipitate changes in the environment regarding a variety of parameters here, such as microclimate and soil chemistry and element cycling, vegetation processes, but also trophic dynamics and some higher order interactions. And that this expression then of the genetic capacity of a particular herbivore, given its genome and how it interacts with the environment, is then contributing through these processes to present to us the kinds of environment, the kind of ecosystem and its characters that we know and call our home. This idea about the ecosystem sort of phenotype, what we see out there. How has it come about and how is it maintained? So in this talk I will try to emphasize for you the implications or some examples of the natural history consequences of these processes. But insofar that we know something about the actual mechanisms by how these events unfold and what controls them. This is, not just so stories. It's scientific natural history. And I hope some of these vignettes you will find interesting. So apart from natural history, we are now using, or we're going to tell you some results from research that are based on exclosure studies. That is, we're setting up an experiment. And I wanted, before I really get going here, to acknowledge John Bryant, who was a faculty in the Department of Biology and Wildlife and IAB, now Professor Emeritus. And he was the instigator of starting up the study of herbivory, particularly by large and small herbivores, as part of the long-term ecological research program here in Wodanza Creek, here in Fairbanks. So without, hopefully not, he's going to be too offended, I sort of dedicate this little chat to him as an instigator of this whole thing that has had all kinds of other projects being generated from his original ideas and his hard work in getting some of these long-term studies going. So the effects of herbivores on ecosystems is a dose response. That is, a lot of herbivory have a larger effect than not so much herbivory. And here's an example of that when here moose have been chewing away on these willows in an extensive manner, incur some serious consequences for the willow. Here, it's stem death. This is a former student expressing her dismay at this event. It was kind of strange. She was a moose biologist. But anyway, we see that with this dose response. So here we have this juxtaposition of high moose density versus low moose density. And you see how this browsing on the willows then incurs some increased rates of mortality when there are lots of mooses as opposed to few mooses. And some of it results in altogether dead plants. And if you roam around on the early succession of willow bars along the Tanana River down from Fairbanks, you will see this in abundance. Although over the 30-some years that I've been fussing around with it, the country has changed a lot. And as you saw in that previous slide of the exclosures, after 10 years from 91 to 2001, well, it was huge changes undergo. It's a very dynamic systems, and that adds another wrinkle to sort of the natural progression of plants' capacities to colonize and grow with how they interact then with herbivores. So with this reduction in live stem biomass, that compromises the plant's capacity to make a living. And the root system, which is of course dependent on the photosynthate or the sugars made in the leaves to keep the roots growing, well, when the stems die and there's fewer leaves, that then of course compromises the production of roots, which compromises the whole livelihood of the plant. So you can see here that with very significant browsing, there's a huge reduction, not just in above ground productivity, but also below ground productivity. But interestingly, once you have reduced stem biomass over winter by these mooses chewing away on the brushwood, the plants will have in the fall retranslocated both carbon and nutrients into their below ground structures. And the next year, they start growing. Sometime before they really start photosynthesizing, you have some stem growth before you get the leaf out. And because it's fewer growing points or buds, the amount of nitrogen for each leaf that's being produced is greater. So you find this interesting occurrence of the leaves that are being produced from browsed plants have a higher nitrogen concentrations than those that are not browsed. So with that having a higher nitrogen concentration, that has an effect on how fast these leaves, when they are dropped on the ground, are going to decompose. And this is just a figure showing decomposition in the laboratory, the cumulative CO2 concentration there or production. It's just showing how fast the microorganisms are breaking down the leaf organic matter. So the faster to do that, the higher CO2 production there, the higher the decomposition. Okay? And if you do some calculations on this, you can see that in this study of this particular species at this time, the flux of carbon through leaf falling on the ground and decomposing is like 50% faster in litter from browsed plants than from unbrowsed plants. So that's one aspect of element cycling that moose browsing appears to be increasing at the rate of. In another study that looked at this business of a dose response, where a student looked at the landscape characteristics across a gradient of moose densities from Fairbanks area being really high densities, about that little one there in parentheses is 1 moose per square mile, versus down in Manly Hot Springs about 1/5, 0.2 moose per square mile. And what this graph shows here is the current annual growth production. And as you can see, between the high density, Fairbanks on the left, versus the low density, Manly on the right, production is about the same. But the open bar on those numbers here refers to the consumption rate of the total willow biomass out there. And in the high moose density area, about 33% of all the current annual growth willow biomass go down the gullet of a moose. Only 6% here, and as you can see, the magnitude of difference here in the densities are roughly about 5-fold, and sure enough, they're about roughly 5-fold differences in overall consumption rate, or what we call offtake on the landscape. So again, there is a dose response to the magnitude and the strength by which these herbivores will affect certain processes. Here, like consumption rates, and as we saw also with regard to decomposition. Moose poop a lot. There'll be a quiz on how often they do that after the talk. But pretty much in the wintertime, they feed for 2 hours and they rest for 2 hours. And every time they are done resting, they take a dump. So pretty much then, 24 divided by 2, 12, 15 piles of poop being produced per day. This is some summer poop. I just thought because it looks like it's doing something. But interesting here in this same study, looking at what the consequences are of having lots of moose on the landscape or not so many moose on the landscape. And here you can see these numbers of pellet groups that for groups per meter squared. And as you can see, about a 6-fold difference here between this. And in terms of the carbon input to the soil that this represent, as well as the nitrogen input, again, you can see it's roughly 5 to 6, maybe close to 8-fold differences in the production of feces into this soil. And this soil, it has got hardly any organic matter in it, and very low nitrogen. And as I point out here, that this rate of carbon input from moose poop and the nitrogen input represent respectively about twice to 4 times that in terms of carbon and nitrogen, that of what would be the normal litter fall in this early successional stance. So the moose again are accelerating element cycling in sort of various nuanced ways. Here by effectively fertilizing the soil at the fairly high rate, much more rapidly than what the leaves, although we've already heard that the leaves that fall also decompose faster after they coming from plants that have been browsed by moose. But there are other kind of more straightforward effects that herbivory can have. We already talked about some of the aspects of productivity. You can see here in the canopy structure, there's my former right-hand man, Carl Olsen, standing out in his field. And you can see this is a sandbar willow. And they are, it's a kind of a browsing lawn As you can see, the height of these willows are roughly mid-thigh, which is roughly the average snow depth in wintertime. They're just browsing right down to the snow. And that obviously changes the structure of the canopy. And with the change in the structure of the canopy comes it how they are, first of all, intercepting light. And with the light, heat to the soil surface, whether it's being absorbed on the soil or reflected before it reaches the soil, reflected by the leaves. It also affects hydrological processes like evaporation rate, because it changes the relative humidity in a stand of here shrubs, whether it's dense or not so dense, courtesy then of how the moose have been browsing and changing the canopy structure. So that has other consequences I will get to here very shortly. But I wanted to also point out that you can see in the foreground here, there's a sandbar willow, and everything looks kind of dark. Why is it dark, Jason? Because they haven't really leafed out yet. So you see those stems, many of which are also dead, but the phenology, the green up, is delayed by more than a week. And in an environment where a major constraint on annual productivity is growing season length, well, that has a rather serious effect. So that's just another example of how not so obvious effect that herbivory might have on the lives of plants. Not just killing them outright, but if they don't, then slowing down and when they are leafing out and thus effectively reducing their overall growing season length. Bummer for the plants. Tough beans, that's how it is. And this is just another example here from out in this particular, these stands. I just sort of sketched in here, kind of crudely, roughly the difference in canopy height. Now, in 20-some years afterwards, this place looked very, very different. But nevertheless, you can see what a radical change in a canopy cover that browsing may have. But as I mentioned, with a change in the canopy structure, the radiation regime, and then the moisture regime of the air, near ground, as well as in the soil, changes the conditions for a variety of plants on whether they will suffer or flourish. And with herbivory, or the absence thereof, there's a change in the field layer in terms of mosses and grasses. And some years ago now, we had some Finnish visitors that were into bugs for some reason. No, fair enough. The guy's name was Utso Suominen, and he was into actually beetles. And here we have, so this is, this exposure hadn't been up for very long, less than 10 years. And there's not a lot of statistical significance, but you see the direction here in terms of how the exposure, or let's say the browsed areas, seem to affect the well-being of a variety of beetle taxa. It's not uniform, but the directions are pretty clear. Undoubtedly, beetles seem to be more abundant in areas that have been browsed by moose, and those are protected by moose, on account of the changes in the physical as well as the biological environment incurred then by browsing. Something you wouldn't necessarily think of right off the bat. Although there are some other interesting examples of how canopy structure is affecting insects, and as we'll see very shortly also how insects might affect vertebrate browsers. One consequence of browsing that I haven't mentioned yet is that with the new shoots being produced from a browsed willow, that shoot tend to be has something called juvenile reversion, that they tend to produce a much larger and more stout, more straight, long shoot. Some of them I measured are more than 8 feet in one growing season. We're not in Iowa measuring corn here. We're talking the Boreal forest, where this shoot length of a doggone lowly shrub can be grow 8 feet. I'll leave it to Jason again to calculate the daily growth increment on that one. But anyways, you can see that they go through these long shoots, and what do you know? Here's this is some data from another Finnish visitor that was interested in sawfly larvae. And as you can see here, in terms of the number of these larvae, it's a function of the shoot length. So with moose, chewing on willows in the wintertime, the next year the willows produce longer shoots, and that seems to favor the lives of sawfly larvae. They tend to like that. And the larvae of sawflies and a variety of other species are important to migratory songbirds here. You know, some of these willow stands, they are really productive, and they are hosting lots and lots of species of migratory birds that come here to nest. And although some of those birds as adults are largely herbivorous, all of them will try to feed their chicks high quality protein in the form of bugs like insect larvae. So the idea then that somehow moose browsing willow stands might have some ripple effects on the well-being of migratory birds relating to their food resources to raise their own is sort of an interesting idea that I'm confident that some of you will want to pursue in more detail. And I just included this picture just because I like it. Anyone has guessed what this caterpillar is? Fair enough. They are the caterpillar of here's a hint, I think that's the first emerging, this overwinter butterfly we have here in the interior, which are the mourning cloak. A lovely butterfly there. Some that you can see even in late April they might come out. You'll see them, you know, they're melted out like beaver lodges, you know, with dark dirt. Everything else is snow around or ice. And there they are, those butterflies, warming in the sun. And these are the caterpillars. And they just look cool with their spines and their red boots. I kind of like them. That's also a sandbar willow they're chewing on there. One interesting, just another little aside on bugs, we got to give them some deference, is willow, the blotch miner, willow blotch miner. And it is feeding on a variety of willow species. Not much on my favorite, which is felt leaf willow, on which we've done a fair bit of work, but other species like some of the interior silix, the sunbar willow, and a couple of other species. But as you can see here, let's see, this is here's from Mara Cummings' thesis. Again, looking at oviposition, that where those adults lay their eggs, they tend to favor willows that have been browsed, or at least in browsed outside exclosures. Whether that is directly a browse or indirect effects, we are unsure of. It probably is largely an indirect effect, that the environment for either the efficacy of oviposition or, because I don't know, or that the survival of the hatched egg, the larvae, is better there. We don't know, but they tend to favor the ovipositing in outside our exclosures where the moose have been browsing. And a little older study here by Brian Allman, another student, showing how these insects, even with a fairly moderate amount of herbivory, that is leaf herbivory, can really affect production of stem production the following year. So here on the left, look at where we had insecticide versus a control that is preventing those nasty bugs, quote unquote nasty bugs, from eating the leaves, and a much higher production, nearly doubling. And that results too in the biomass of being browsed by moose is much higher in the absence of these plants being fed upon, their leaves being fed upon the prior year, than it was if the insects had conducted their own herbivory. And you see also the proportion of what's being browsed again. So there are some interesting little stories there about how from the largest organisms, so a 1,500-pound moose, to the whatever milligram little moth, their lives are intertwined in their on their feeding grounds, and that little moth can have a fairly substantial effect on the food resources of moose and the subsequent offtake that the moose incur on the landscape. Something you would not think of, seeing those little mothies flying around, that their lives should be this much intertwined. But they are. One basic endeavor in the LTR, the Long-Term Ecological Research Program, at the start was looking at successional dynamics. That is primary succession, the first colonization of newly emergent sandbars, and how the various willow species colonize first, and then after 10 to 20 years you get alders and subsequently popple and white spruce and whatnot. And it was really John Bryant's idea then to see what happens if we exclude many of the vertebrate mammalian herbivores. And here's an example of what happens. So the response variable here is the alder to willow ratio. And as you can see here, times this exclusion, and inside the exclosures, in the control there, you see how the alder ratio changes. And outside where it's browsed, the willow alder ratio increased dramatically in a linear fashion, versus the alder to willow ratio inside the exclosure is coming up to an asymptote. Clearly this curve is going to have a crook in it. Succession is going to happen sooner or later. But you can see how that moose, in effect then, is accelerating the transition from willow to alder in these particular stands. In other words, speeding up this change, the successional change. And in a general sense, forest development. All right, but there's more to the story. Trust me. Here the low bush variety, the snowshoe hare. And this species we have studied on the floodplain, but also a variety of other ecosystems around Alaska. So I want to now go through some of the information about snowshoe hares. Here's Carl Olsen again, a few years later. This is in 2005, and he's standing in a plantation of white spruce on the floodplain. They were planted as seedlings, and this is 15 years after they were planted, which some might say that's really interesting. And if you were a forester, you would think that's nightmarish. Not much is going on here. The deal again being that it's well, you're familiar with it finally now, today, huh? It's a hot, dry environment. And that physical environment has some serious consequences for the well, not so much generation, but the growth of spruce. We know we have put out seed traps out there, little wash basins. and seeds from all the species come in the early succession. And we see sometimes that they're little germins of spruce. And they're there this summer, and next summer they're gone. Some of them were maybe covered in the flood, but others there's croak. So we want to understand how is these plants then being distributed through time in their abundance? Why is it this sequential? What is it that prevents spruce from just establishing early on? And to do that, we were cognizant of the fact, like I mentioned, that these early section of sandbars, they can be hot and dry there. And other investigators in LTR demonstrated out there evaporation rates is twice that of precipitation. These early section ecosystems the water is coming largely from being wicked up through the soil, because many of these sandbars and the islands there's hyporheic water, subsurface water flowing underneath. You stand there about a meter or so down beneath your feet. Water is coursing, and it's getting wicked up through that fine textured silt. So, in light of this idea of it being a physical challenging environment, we set up a bunch of other exclosures across a terrace gradient, where we had very young sites and older sites from about 5 to about 25 years. That had then different amount of older vegetation on it, which of course would ameliorate the physical environment for spruce that being planted there. So I just want to impress upon you again how it can get hot out there. We instrumented the soil and air, but also put little thermistors in amongst the needle clusters. And as you can see here, I sort of crudely identified just to show you this domain here, how you're going to get really hot in those needle clusters at temperature that shuts down basically photosynthesis. And that clearly has a effect then on their growth potential. So it gets really hot out there. And but in addition, we found out as this experiment went on how snowshoe hares are fairly scarce out in the open willow bars. Not enough cover from particularly avian predators. And in this prior slide right here, that also had planted spruce back in with alders, thinking that the alders had that fixed nitrogen, which is a critical element for the plants to grow, would give the spruce a real boost. And the first few years after this experiment, after this experiment started, sure enough, those spruce liked the association of alder right well. But then the alders grew up, and they provided cover for bunnies, to the predators. And the hares moved in and killed single spruce tree. Thunk. So, okay. That might be another factor that affects the abundance of spruce in these landscapes. Anyway, again, with the warm and all this evaporation, you get lots of water leaving and there's salt being left behind. So you see that you get actually a salt crust out there on the floodplain with calcium carbonates and calcium sulfate. And the latter seem to have a negative effect on spruce growth. But either way, you can see that when it is browsed, it really makes a big effect then on the soil chemistry. And you can see that in this wolf track, there's a little crystal there that's calcite. And that's, and you walk out there, bare feet, got a nice sound effect. But unfortunately for the spruce, this combination then of the radiation and the low relative humidity and this high salt concentration seem to have a really negative effect on the spruce functional establishment and growth. And here's just showing some results of the height after about 5 years following planting. And as you can see, they do much better at the older sites that are cooler and wetter than the warmer and drier. But at this point, not much different between exclosure and control. Roughly the same. So fast forward 10 years, and things have changed big time. As you can see here, the survival and the growth of white spruce is really affected by the exposure to herbivory. And the exposure to herbivory is much greater in these older sites than in the young sites. So again, here with these observations, it seemed to me that our earlier pronouncement that herbivory will speed up succession, well, it might be stage dependent. And that sometimes it will speed it up, for other vegetation it might slow it down. So what does it do? Well, sometimes it do this, sometimes it do that, depending on the situation and where we are in succession. Now the students that worked on some of this stuff, Justin Olin has also extended his inquiries to a different ecosystem. Here's from Denali Park, looking at how snowshoe hares, when they are around, will interact with spruce. We know with the warming climate, we think about the tree line expansion, both by elevation and by latitude. And he was observing that snowshoe hares in Denali make a lot of use of sort of high elevation habitats. And as you can see here, in terms of the hair pellets as an indication of hair abundance, it's increasing with elevation. And spruce seedling abundance is negatively related to elevation. And you can also see in terms of the pellets, which is, again, as you're going up in elevation, and how the spruce seedlings are responding to then essentially the presence of hares. And this inverse correlation then between hair density and spruce abundance suggests that the hares act as kind of a filter to the expansion of spruce into the higher elevations in the tree line. Here's some other data from that study. Here is both in Denali and along the Kaikuk River up near Wiseman. So now we're talking about the latitudinal effects. Again, spruce age, and on top there you see proportion browsed. They focus most of the browsing between perhaps 10 to 20 years of age. And after the spruce is about 2 meters high, they functionally be able to escape hair browsing. What you can see here, this is now the solid line is no browsing, moderate browsing, and severe browsing. As you can see with severe browsing, the spruce reached the height at which it will escape herbivory about 10 years later. That is, there's no herbivory. So clearly, again, these bunnies have an effect on the growth trajectory and potential of survival for these spruce at the elevational and latitudinal tree line. And I just want to throw this in. When there's lots of bunnies, they eat everything. And here's an example of our general conclusion that once the spruce become about 2 meters, their homes, they're safe, but not quite true. As you can see on the right there, that spruce is a lot more than 2 meters high, and it's been girdled and on the way to its grave. So we find then that with lots of hares in the landscape, there's more spruce being browsed. It's generally not their favorite food by any means, but they will eat it when there are lots of bunnies around and other food resources might be declining in availability. So you can see then that here with lots of bunnies, well, a lot more spruce is being browsed. And just Knowles worked this into a population model and showing how this herbivory by hares, which is nevertheless a pulse event. They're not there all the time. They're abundant, generally on sort of decadal scale. Really has an effect, not just in our experiments of exclusion and stuff, but out in the natural landscape, on the natural establishment of white spruce on the Tanana. This is back here on the Tanana River floodplain. So, and again, that also feeds back to this idea that hares, through their effect on spruce, when the hares are abundant, slows down successional change. But also that it can perhaps indicate here that they are affecting the age structure. And that is shown here in this kind of muddled graph. You see the bars here with the gray bars is when there are the hair high and how and the open is hair low, and you see then the regeneration, the age structure here, years of regeneration of probability of trees germinating as a function of hair abundance. And that indeed, that we find that that's on the Tanana River, in this area, that the age structure of this developing forest is greatly influenced by the presence of snowshoe hares. And this was kind of neat because we heard something similar. You might have heard about Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management here in America, noted in Sand County Almanac under the title in February, Good Oak, when he was talking about noticing the age structure there of oaks and the presence of rabbits, and how there were hardly any seedlings around when the rabbits were abundant. And how he says, indeed, it's all too clear that every surviving oak is a product of either rabbit negligence or rabbit scarcity. And someday, some patient botanist will draw a frequency curve of oak birth and show that the curve humps every 10 years. That then, that every And that hump originated from a low in the 10-year rabbit cycle. And about 70 years later, Justin Olness did just that with white spruce. And he says here, as with the oaks of Aldo Leopold Sand County, the survival and growth of the white spruce in interior Alaska is significantly reduced by snowshoe hares when mass seeding events coincide with the peak abundance of snowshoe hares. And kind of little tongue-in-cheek paraphrasing Aldo Leopold, indeed, it is all too clear that every surviving spruce seedling owns much of its fortunes from being born in the low of the 10-year rabbit cycle or 10-year snowshoe hare cycle. So there it is. But as you can see from the data, it's not super clear-cut. But we'll be able to, as you saw here, we can explain, about 40% of the variation in the age structure based on snowshoe hares alone. Okay, we're getting toward the end here. It's an hour, right? And then it's curtains. These little vignettes then, I'm trying to impress upon you how a rather eclectic selection of herbivores, moose and snowshoe hares, and there are many others, their activities trespass onto the phenotype of the landscape, structural landscape. What species are there? What the composition of species composition are there? How they grow? How they persist? And we noticed in the fairly early, actually one of the first studies I was involved in with a graduate student, we again looked at these studies from Fairbanks to Manly with high moose density, low moose density, that there were radical changes in the preponderance of willow communities versus alder communities along the Tanana as you go from high moose density to low moose density. And here's some summarized data there about the willow in terms of aerial extent ratio, about 0.8, 1.9 on lower density. That the high moose density is affecting, the abundance of willow on the landscape. And that this landscape effect is in part also affected by the age structure. As you're having more moose browsing, this dose response, higher rates of herbivory, it's shifting the age structure of the plant communities from older to younger. And the overall reason for these changes in moose densities, we think, is in large part a function of predation. Out there in the Tanana Flats, at least at one point within recent memory, roughly 20% of the moose population went down the gullet of a predator every year. It's like, really? What's the turnover of the population within the renewal of a LTR proposal? A pretty dynamic system. So not only are we talking about those pesky mooses chewing away on the brushwood, but also that the predators are, chewing away on the moose. And what kind of consequence does that interaction have? Well, we know then from these high moose densities at the East Tanana Flats of about 1 moose per square mile, versus like in the Yukon River, it's just 1/10 of that. And you see the moose to wolf ratios go from very high to very low, and the willow alder ratios go from, they increase by order of magnitude. So this leads us to this idea that we know that the predators might be able to regulate the abundance of vegetation through an indirect interaction. The moose consume the willows and other deciduous browse, so they obviously have a negative effect overall on their food supply. But the wolves consume moose, cutting back their densities and thus alleviating some of the browsing pressure, benefiting the willows are in greater abundance. And this whole idea of a top-down regulation of a predator on an herbivore and the primary producer, the plant, is known as a trophic cascade. And it's predicated, of course, that indeed all the lower trophic levels are limited by the action of the trophic level above. In terms of their overall population dynamics, that's probably somewhat simplistic, but it might be strong enough to at least unfold in this way. And we have numerous fabulous examples of this kind of three trophic levels effect in both the marine system and the freshwater aquatic systems, as well as in other terrestrial systems. And we might have heard about Yellowstone after they introduced wolves there. That suddenly now, with the wolves, have an effect on the elk, both numerically but also their behavior in terms of where they go to feed, that there is a change in that ecosystem in terms of regeneration of willows and stream stabilization, as well as much more aspen growth. Sort of analogous to what we're seeing here. And what is so interesting in that in the Yukon Flats with so few moose, they're strong and healthy. They have they're twinning at the high rate, but most of those twins go down the gullet of a bear in the summertime. And in the winter, the wolves have their way with their parents. So that is the moose calf's parents. It's not cannibalism I'm talking about. And it's resulting in a really different landscape. Clearly, there are other factors going on. But you can see that one of them relates to the low densities of moose that generates, this, what kind of looks like a cornfield, Boreal forest cornfield, very different from the Tanana, for example, where we got much higher moose densities and much more alder being a much more important component of the riparian vegetation. Here you got huge things. So anyway, I hope these little tidbits have impressed upon you how it's possible under certain conditions, quite a few conditions, how herbivores can structure ecological systems. And now I've identified some of the mechanisms by which that might happen in terms of changing the resource array and the various ecological processes that undergird the productivity of any plant or animal species that we can think of. And that generates then this ecosystem phenotype, our familiar woods that are of a certain character due to this interaction. I'd like to acknowledge that much of this research was done on the backs of graduate students. Underpaid, hard-worked youngsters. And they worked in a variety of places here in Alaska, and I'm very much indebted to what I've learned from them. And it's with some mixture of embarrassment and delight that I find myself becoming more and more obsolete with every thesis defense that is completed. So, but anyway, I'm at the end here, and on this hot day, as the saying goes around this neck of the woods, July is here, but winter is coming. And with luck, the supreme season will be upon us. And it's my hope that we all will go out and check out the Book of Winter. There is stories there to be read, and I hope I've indicated what kinds of stories you might find if you do so. So, thank you for your attention.
Do we have time for questions? Can you take any questions?
Sure.
Okay, so if you have
I have a question. I'm going to bring the microphone to you since we're being recorded. Anybody have any questions? Wow. That's impressive.
Well, I'd say it's impressive.
What is the next big thing that you're looking at and what's the biggest question in your mind right now and where you want to go next?
Ooh, is this being recorded?
It is.
Well,
And retirement can't be an answer.
Well, there is I think I've told you about this, Jason. We kind of worked together for a long time. Anyway, well, I will disclose it then, because it relates to sort of what we're talking about here, and that is up in the south center Brooks Range, up around Wiseman, along the Tetrick River. There's something called this large landslide known as frozen debris loads. That's courtesy of permafrost warming and melting. And we have these landslides that are like big, nearly a mile long, a third of a mile wide, 67 feet tall. The shear zone of this slide is like 60 feet below your feet. There's a lot of Mother Earth that's coming down the hillside. Some of them have moved about 30 meters per year, 90, nearly 100 feet per year. And they had to route the haul road around them, rebuild it, because we'll take it out the haul road. Not a good thing for the most important economic road in the state. They're also, of course, threatening the pipeline and the fiber optic cable and all kinds of stuff. But those landslides, I didn't talk about having this talk, churn up the ground, and they change the vegetation, they change the end of those large reloads. The thermal conditions are different. Nutrient cycling, trace gas emissions are all likely to be different. Vegetation is different. The front end of these frozen debris loads are churned up mineral soil, and a lot of herbivores, whether it be sheep, moose, caribou, snow hares, go and eat this mineral soil. Didn't talk about that in this talk, but to get critical minerals and self-medicate for eating food that's part of their physiology. So there they are, this physical event, courtesy of the bellwether of climate change, permafrost thaw, that change vegetation, that draws in these herbivores like magnets. And what do you know? Where there's herbivores, well, the predators follow. So we have this physical event that is precipitating this cascade of ecological events, of redistributing animal populations due to the change in the distribution of their food resources. And that's also so it's become this hotbed of ecological activity. And I think that is just a really interesting phenomenon to look at. There are hundreds of these frozen debris loads in the Brooks Range. Ones of concern for the DOT in Alaska are, of course, both close to the road. And that's perhaps where you can really get funding to do this. But it is such a neat event, and I think I would love to be able to sink my teeth into that one for a short period of time, then voice it over on something. Here you go.
That's called retirement. Any other questions?
Oh, Joe knows a lot about stuff. Yes, Joe.
In some of John Bryan's work, especially when he was working with the birch and herbivory for moose and rabbits and whatnot, he found that the birch branches that had been chomped on were producing something that was toxic to the moose's stomachs.
Right.
Now, is any of that happening with the willows or any of the work that you've been doing?
I have looked at it a little bit. And that, talking about this eating mineral soil known as geophagy, that in birch is a real toxin. It's called papyriferric acid, and it shuts down the energy-producing compounds in the cell. The ATP cuts down the Krebs cycle. No more ATP, no more life as we know it. So it's a bad. You can't make a living just eating birch. No way. But the willows are full of something called tannins, which is a complex carbon complex or phenolic rings that have a lot of several crummy effects. First of all, they bind onto the plant protein. So every bite that a moose takes of a juicy willow, that tannin in there is binding the protein, so the moose are not be able to access that protein and digest it and go for its own maintenance and growth. So that's a bummer. Also, when they eat tannins, they tend to, there's a more complicated cellular physiology that they end up dumping sodium. It's a critical mineral. So, and there also are some of these physiology resulting in acidification of the blood, acidosis. Not good. Your blood should just stay right there, about neutral, and not get acidic. So, but these bunnies and other herbivores, we don't know, this geophagy is done both in mammals as well as birds. So there are three things that they get. They get critical mineral like sodium, which I need. There might be clays in that soil that will actually bind to the tannins and prevent them from deactivating them. And then the alkaline soil, whether it's on the floodplain or in these frozen debris lobes or mineral soil is alkaline, and that counteracts acidosis. So they get a lot of benefits from it, including sort of the self-medication to deal with the fact that they are herbivores and they're only going to eat stuff that's not so good for them. After all, what they eat is so radically different from their bodies. It's a stoichiometric mismatch. The composition of their food, by the way of elemental composition, is radically different. So that is a problem for them, as well as for vegetarians.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? Please, go ahead. Yeah, last question.
In answering your first question, you talked about some physical events, the mass wasting events in the Brook Range, and their effect on speciation of the various plants and herbivores and everything there. Do you feel like at this point, like you and your students have compiled enough information to do any sort of predictive modeling for what you could expect to see 5, 10, 20 years from now in various places?
You mean from the floodplain and other?
Yeah,
or
sure.
are you talking about the Brooks Range in particular?
I mean, I know some of the research was in Denali, and I know you
so
spoke
already
about that as well.
we are working on that. We're actually trying to write a little synthesis paper on 30 years of fussing around with this. But Dresden Owens in particular did quite a bit of modeling, but there's lots more to be done. With regards to the Brooks Range, that is still yet to be done. I'm collaborating with some people in this building, Margaret Darrow, geological engineer, that has done modeling of the behavior of these frozen debris lobes. But how that whole ecological scenario is going to unfold, we don't know, but it certainly is amenable to some modeling to try to not to merely predict what's going to happen, but rather try to clarify our thinking on how things work. And given a set of assumptions, we're going to get some output of a model, which is a crude representation of reality, but that will clarify our thinking. So often, you're probably aware that modeling early in the study can be very useful to get yourself organized as to what are the various parameters in terms of their importance, rather than at the end of the study that, okay, now I know everything, so now we're going to model and see what happens in 2100. No offense, right? But anyway. That's inappropriate. It's a joke that just... Anyway.